this Compliance Alliance hosted event, which I want to thank you so much, the Compliance Alliance, for doing this. Today we're going to talk about navigating the ever-changing complexities of security and compliance. And I'm sure everyone in the room, everyone raise their hand if they're involved with security and compliance, they're trying to go through security and compliance right now, trying to achieve a framework? Okay. That's most of us, and it affects us, every day. We deal with that and work in that space. And as AWS, we're proud to be a Compliance Alliance partner because it's bringing together thought leaders and experts in this space to help educate customers on on the importance of security and compliance in the cloud. And just to give you a little bit of background about me, my role with AWS, I'm on the security and compliance partner team. We help customers navigate and architect their workloads to achieve regulatory compliance requirements. And then I also we run a global security and compliance acceleration program from AWS, which we have vetted security and compliance partners that help customers automate and accelerate that process. And that can be for SOC 2, PCI, ISO, on down the line, FedRAMP. So we're here to help. And talking about partners, I want to introduce our panel here of partners. We've got Venkat, we have Chuck, and we have Patrice. So I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, in the corner. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrice. I'm the guy with the French accent on the panel. I specialize in fintech, so financial technology, neobanks, embedded banking, and my customers have no choice but to be secure and compliant. Otherwise, their partner banks would not let them start. Most, if not all, of my customers do their backend system at Amazon. Most of them do not have a DevOps team that would know what they need to do to control their deployment. So I've been referring a lot of them to Venkat. And almost all of them need to capture personally identifiable information, credit card numbers and other things. And so they are a perfect candidate for working with VGS if they don't want to get in trouble.
Hey everyone, I am Chuck Yu. I'm the CEO of VGS. We help companies store, secure, transmit their sensitive data. So anything from PCI data to PII data.
I'm Venkat. I'm the CEO for Duplo Cloud. We offer a DevSecOps platform that the customers can install in their cloud account. And the promise sort of is that if you use the platform, you can give more higher level specification, and the system will make sure that automatically things are secure, compliant, and will do all the lower level nuances and whatnot without requiring a lot of subject matter expertise. So the platform is used by developers, DevOps equally, and so forth.
Us. Can you hear me? Okay. Is that okay? Okay, we're good. So everyone here has different backgrounds. We come from different spaces. And what I want to ask the panel here is, how should a startup begin their compliance journey? What go from zero to something? How do they achieve that? Start with Patrice.
We'll play past mine.
Yeah, thanks. In the case of financial services, the starting point often is a long spreadsheet that a bank or a BaaS company, as we call them, bank as a service company, will send to the fintech and say, hey, you have to comply with all these things. And this is a long list of IT and mobile device management and clean desk policies and all sorts of things. The difficulty for most companies is where to start and how to prioritize these things. So we're trying our best to tell them where to start. Fortunately, there are a number of easy things to get started with, and you don't really need to have everything, all of your ducks in a row immediately. But the starting point is usually pretty overwhelming in the fintech space because banks are regulated and they don't want to get in trouble. And they want to show to their regulators that they ask all the right questions to the fintech. So they bombard the fintech with probably too many questions. The obvious thing to start with is securing the back end of your infrastructure and convincing people that your developers may not necessarily know what they do, and you can't just trust what they have done, and you need to have an additional layer of verification and controls in place. And that would be the starting point. After that, you can look at the other things, but we usually try to figure out the low-hanging fruits first and get them knocked off the list quickly.
Yeah, even earlier than that in your startup journey, you should figure out what's relevant, like what frameworks apply to you and don't apply to you. So things like a privacy framework, like a GDPR or CPA, or HIPAA if you're dealing with healthcare information, PCI if you're dealing with payment data. That's kind of the first thing you have to do is like, is this an area where this is directly in scope and I have to comply with it? Is this an area that's adjacent? I can accept some risk? Or is this an area where like, it doesn't apply to me at all? Great, this is no longer relevant. Once you get that first wave of understanding done, take a deep breath, right? Take a deep breath, breathe, and realize, okay, this is what's adjacent to me. I've narrowed the field. And then that's when people like us will show up and help you make it a lot easier. But I think that's definitely the right starting point. It's just knowing what is relevant and what isn't.
Yeah, I think once you have like done that part, as in you sort of like figure out whether your customers and yourself are in a regulated industry, if you have to meet a particular standard and whatnot, I guess what you have to figure out is that how would you actually go about do the deployment? Do you actually have the subject matter expertise in your team? Because I mean, half of the compliance will probably lie in the scope of the cloud provider. So now you're looking for people who understand compliance, who understand security, who understand operations, and who know how to code so that they can do, you know, infrastructure as a code and whatnot. So, I mean, we call these people DevSecOps engineer, but I mean, it's so difficult to find like all these skill sets in one person. So then like, how do you do that, right? So I think it's better to think about these things early on, and then appropriately, you should basically pick your cloud technologies and so forth. So I think I would second the thought is that first start with the framework. And I think if you have a good sense of the framework, like PCI is substantially different than SOC 2, basically, right? I mean, the investment, how much you have to do and whatnot is a lot more. So yeah, I think sort of like work through that, find out if you have subject matter expertise, and then figure out like what tools and softwares and people that you need to help you along the journey.
From an AWS standpoint, we have a lot of resources to help startups. We have a startup security baseline. It's 14 controls just to get the startups thinking about security. And then we also have a well-architected tool where you can go into your AWS account and run through a bunch of questions based on different pillars of the well-architected framework that will then give you a score on what your security posture is, how can you can improve or enhance your environment. And then like we have our partners here that come in and help you because you're going to need someone to build out, you know, security policies, procedures, all of your processes. You probably need a gap assessment as well. So you're going to need partners involved in that process throughout, especially because, you know, compliance can be expensive and time consuming. And also it takes up a lot of resources. So you have to have, if you don't have those in-house experts, you know, that's where partners come in to accelerate that process. And when we talk about security and we talk about compliance, you know, everyone uses them interchangeably, right? How do we dissect what each is in building a, you know, a security program? So you have security on one hand that, you know, you need to build out your technical controls to help you know, be safe and with your assets. And then you have the frameworks which help you define what your controls should be to secure those assets. So I just want to get your take on how would you define the difference between security and compliance and how they come together?
So, I think what is security, right? Security is basically a set of configurations that you can actually put together in either your cloud configurations or your application and so forth. And security is never ending. I mean, you can keep going and you can never be secure, right? So you can keep doing that and that, or you could basically decide to do just some very, very basic things and then call that secure, right? I mean, should I block outbound or should I not block outbound, basically, right? I mean, these are different choices. What I think the compliance standards, as I've understood, kind of do is that they give you a prescription of what you need to do, and as for that matter, what you don't need to do. Like, for example, PCI will be very, very explicit, and okay, you need to block outbound, or you need to actually have an outbound proxy and whatnot. There is a control. Whereas SOC 2 or HIPAA, for example, if I remember, they're not prescriptive about that. They basically, secure it kind of a stuff. So I think compliance is basically, I would say, in some senses, a subset, in the sense that it would scope these controls down and say that, okay, as long as you do these things, I would certify you, or you are compliant to so and so framework and so forth. So that's like one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I can give you an example of the difference between compliance and security if we look at privacy, right? So if you are holding customers' data and you need to comply with privacy laws, if you're successful, which I wish you all to be, and you exceed $10 million in revenues or have more than 50,000 users in California, or you expand into Europe, then you have to comply with CCPA and GDPR in Europe. And part of it has to do with security. Make sure that you don't lose accidentally the data of your customers. But there's also another aspect, which is your customers under the law have the right to come to knock on your door and say, hey, can you tell me what data you have on me? Can I have a copy of that data? And in some cases, can you delete that data because I'm upset and I don't want to hear about you as a service provider anymore, and I want my data deleted. That is part of the compliance that has very little to do with security. You need to be able to react to somebody sending you an email and asking, or a phone call, or entering a web form and saying, hey, can I have a copy of the data you have on me? And you only have so many days to acknowledge the receipt of that email, and you only have so many days to respond to the request. So yes, you need the security at the back end to make sure that you have not lost or distorted the data, but you need to have the procedures in place to be able to react to these things. And in banking, there's a lot of compliance that has very little to do with security. Like if you are in the payment space and you want to handle disputes because your customers are not recognizing a transaction in your mobile app, then you have to comply with something called Regulation E, which also says, hey, you have so many days to respond to a dispute. You have to provide a temporary credit back to the person, then you have to talk to the merchant. This would be another example of compliance that has very little to do with security.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to pass on this question given our company name. So I didn't think it was fair that I jumped in first. I think these guys nailed it. Like, security is kind of an ongoing exercise. Like you'll see in a more mature kind of setup, it often lives with the technology function, whereas in contrast, compliance tends to live with a legal or freestanding compliance function. So you can be good at one and terrible at the other, and vice versa, and that's absolutely true. In general, they're hand in hand. Compliance in general is meant to help you be more secure, right? And so they're always bucketed together, but in reality, they're very different skills and practices that you have to develop simultaneously within your organization.
Very good insights there. What do you feel, so we're talking about security and compliance. How would a startup staff for security and compliance?
Well, in a true startup fashion, the CEO is probably the chief compliance officer, it's probably the CFO and the CEO and everything else at the same time. With that said, there are certain industries, for example, if you deal with payments, you're touching financial services, your regulator will require you to have a chief compliance officer at the very beginning. So I'll let Patrice, I don't want to steal his thunder there. In general, I would say compliance is not something you do and you forget. Neither is security, right? It's not something you can address in a sprint. It's not something that like you do in a 6-week cycle and it goes away. So from the very beginning of your planning, as you're building out your company, you should think about a sustained, steady investment that grows in these areas.
Yeah, like you said, right? I mean, the CEO is the chief compliance officer, CTO is the CISO. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question? I lost my.
How would a startup staff for building their security compliance program?
Yeah, I think at a high level, what you might want to do is that basically split the compliance program and responsibilities into sort of like two portions, technical and non-technical. Technical is probably something that your engineering team can sort of be well versed with and so forth. At least they'll be able to understand it. They may or may not be able to or want to implement the controls. That's probably the next layer DevOps and SecOps and so forth, right? So that portion an engineering team can sort of like take care of, and then the other portion is the policies and procedures and the stuff like, for example, Patrice talked about, that can be a separate function and so forth. So typically what we see in startups is that the latter, the non-technical part, invariably is sort of like outsourced in the form of like slice CISOs and so forth, or part-time CISOs or compliance officers and stuff. And then when it comes to technical, I would basically say is that life is going to get easier as we go forward, especially with software. Even like 10-15 years back, I mean, infrastructure was so complicated with servers and network and storage and whatnot, right? I mean, like you needed 100 people to manage a Cisco infrastructure, but then Amazon came and solved the infrastructure as a service problem, and then they took care of that level of compliance and security. So then I think now the industry is moving at a place where DevOps is going to get easier. Right, DevOps become DevOps as a service to a large extent. Security as a service, saying that would probably be too much because it's just too broad. But at least you can get DevOps, SecOps, certain compliance standards as software. And in that sense, I think life will get easier and easier as you go along. But that's how I would sort of like approach it.
Yes, so certainly you can outsource or offshore some of the functions, and you can buy services from VGS and from Duplo Cloud, and AWS has a great marketplace that's available on their website where you can figure out what you can buy from whom. One piece of advice I would give is first map some compliance and security activities onto your existing team. And a good place to start is, in most cases, if you have to be compliant with a number of regulations, you are going to be asked to set up what is called an incident response team, an IRT. An incident response team is not something that you outsource. You have to designate volunteers, right? You have to get the phone numbers and personal email addresses of a few people so that if you get hacked on a Saturday, you can call these people and say, hey, everybody back in the office on Saturday night, we need to figure out what happened. And even before you get hacked, you probably want to do what we call tabletop exercises, which is, hey, if we got hacked in this way or that way, how would we react? And as you involve people in these exercises, starting with a tabletop exercise where nothing is for real, but you're just rehearsing, you start ingraining in the mindset of your own staff, developers and marketers and salespeople, the fact that they have to contribute to the compliance, and maybe you can rotate the responsibility so that not the same three guys are always on the incident response team. That's what I would advise people to start with.
Well, when building, workloads for security compliance, what is the biggest misconception? And I can start with one because this happens all the time. I'm building on AWS, so I'm compliant with PCI or other different frameworks, and it's all about that shared responsibility model that people need to remember. So you're building on AWS, you're utilizing different services. Each service has different, responsibilities for the customer. So that's something to keep in mind. And we have, several resources out there on AWS Artifact that can help you navigate that process. And we have a new one, just so everybody knows. It's called Customer Compliance Guides that are on AWS Artifact. So what they do is they take our shared responsibility model and break it down to the AWS service. So, and it's mapped to NIST 853, HIPAA, SOC 2, PCI, and others. So if you go on there, you look up, S3 or IAM, and you search for different controls, it'll say the AWS best practice for the customer is to do this, to secure, this piece of, the pie that you are responsible for.
Oh yeah, that's very true. I've had a number of companies, basically telling their CEO, hey, we're on AWS. These guys have a big target painted on their back, so we're safe because they have to pay attention to what they're doing. Well, that's not true because, you're responsible for your part of the stuff. Something else that I think people are not necessarily realizing, a number of companies in my space, but I'm sure it's true of other industry segments, distribute their service through smartphone apps. They push an iOS or an Android app to their website and they interact with people on their websites. And I'm surprised by the small number of companies that are actually telling us, oh, by the way, besides looking at all the backend and all the cloud system, would you look at our app and tell us whether it's secure or not? And there's a lot of ways to not be secure in a mobile app. So you have to make sure that you don't necessarily just close all of your windows and back doors, but the front door, which is your smartphone app, which by the way is challenging because your engineers are going to update the app every 3 weeks, right? So your app is a moving target. And I can assure you that, at least in the fintech sector, because people are moving money, if the bad guys who buy stores of credit cards on the dark web figure out that your app is not secure, you're going to lose tens of thousands of dollars in the first week of deployment. So you really need to understand that having all the backend security and relying on AWS is not enough. You really need to figure out what are your responsibilities and how you have implemented your security everywhere, including in your mobile app.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I basically second Patrice in doing that. I mean, this is a very common misconception. I mean, I've heard it like so many times. Like, people have a database which is on a public internet open to 000, and then they claim that okay, they are compliant because AWS is compliant, right? And sometimes, I mean, especially some standards are actually not so prescriptive. Some standards are not so prescriptive. Like for example, SOC 2. I don't know how many people know, but you cannot fail a SOC 2. It's sort of an assessment. It's sort of a report, basically, right? So people are like, okay, I'm SOC 2 certified in spite of all those things, and then you actually, in a lot of cases, you can actually game the system. So those are the things that we should, in general, try to like sort of avoid.
Yeah, I 100% agree with the general concept of like, Big Brother's got your back is not a good posture. You might want to take personal ownership and responsibility for these things. So I 100% agree with that. With that in mind, I think the one misconception, going back to the original question, is when there's a compliance obligation, it's prohibitively expensive. That's often just not the case, right? Like, people see compliance as, oh, this is going to slow down my growth. This is going to slow down my dev calendar. If you get the right instrumentation and tooling built in early, I think it actually is an area of strength and not weakness. That's something that you'll be able to advertise as something I've done better. I've thought through my architecture. I've done it this way. It will check every box when it comes to compliance obligations, X, Y, and Z. And on a go forward basis, this is something that's, still front and center, but kind of out of sight, out of mind in terms of the maintenance obligation.
And this one's for Venkat. So how do you talk to your customers about their security and compliance posture?
Yeah, I think you mean prospects or existing customers?
Either.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, existing customers, we have to take care of them. So to a large extent, I would basically say that they rely on us. We give them best practices, software, and so forth, and they really have to go sort of like out of the way to get out of compliance and security and so on. So I mean, it's very software driven, automated. I mean, the whole point is that you continue to be productive. You don't have to spend so much money on human resources, but at the same time, you're secure and compliant as well. So yeah, when we talk to prospects, I guess like the place where we start with is that like, I mean, is security important, right? And the answer is like, kind of a thing, or like they'll be like, yeah, it's very important. And then if it's very important, you can sort of tell if it's a B2B business, right? So a lot of people, I would basically say, tend to see that if they're B2C, nobody is really questioning them. So, or they just may not have any secure information, right? I mean, just that could just be the nature of the software. So yeah, if you are in an industry where you have B2B clients, enterprise customers, we start by asking, okay, what compliance standard are you required to meet? And they would be like, okay, SOC 2, ISO, and so forth. And then we would be like, okay, how are you doing this today? Are you even following a framework? And so forth. So we would sort of like start from there. What framework are you following? What compliance standard you have to meet? And when you have to meet, are you in production already? Are you not in production? And how much subject matter expertise do you have in-house in order to do this? And then finally, I think the very important question is, how fast do you need to move, right? Because inherently, if you put in a lot of security controls without substantial automation, it's going to slow things down for you. So depending on that, I think we would sort of like have the conversation, and there are like various different factors and so forth. The most common thing, at least in our user base or the prospect base that we come across, is that people really want to move fast. That's one, because they're younger companies. Number two, they don't have a lot of money to spend on DevOps and IT and so on, because they're more like cost centers. They would rather save that money for the for their engineering. And finally, the third thing is that they're all trying to sell to enterprises, right? So how do you sort of like solve this problem? And in our opinion, it has to be solved by a as a service solution and so forth. And that's sort of like how we go through that.
And this one's for Chuck, because we were talking a little earlier about why do you think every company should consider itself a payments company?
Fintech company.
A fintech.
Fintech company.
Sorry.
And I think it's kind of like the right way to tee it up. Like most people think, yeah, fintech, you're collecting, you're enabling payments. I think the financial movements of money of every company is much, much bigger than that at this point in time, right? Like we're all ultimately, if you're a business, you're making money. You could be a nonprofit, but you have to have money coming in, money going out. You have payroll obligations, you have vendors to pay out. So you're ultimately always moving money on your, like one way or another, just as a business, right? And then the question is like, can you bring fintech elements into your ecosystem to do it cheaper, more efficiently, more effectively? Like you can't pay employees on a delay. How do you get it there the next day? Like there are very simple things that are fundamental that fintechs bring to the table that every company should embrace and say, okay, yeah, this is part of my stack.
And last question we have here is, we'll start with Patrice. So everyone thinks, oh, I got my SOC 2 attestation, I got my, I'm PCI compliant, I'm done, right? So, let's talk about why compliance is not just a, checkbox activity.
I can give an example. I was this morning with a client of mine on the phone. They're going to release a new version of their mobile app, and it's a fintech app. And they haven't implemented yet something that we call device binding, which is, you may have experienced this, where you have a service that you access through your phone, and then you lose your phone, or you change your phone, or you access the service from your wife's computer or whatever. And you get an email that says, hey, we've detected that you were accessing the service from a new device. Is that you? And this kind of, again, procedural thinking about what can go wrong. So inventorying, some account, this is an example of account takeovers, right? An account is taken over because somebody lost their phone, or somebody has a phone emulator somewhere in Kazakhstan pretending to be a phone in the US, and The software was not developed to detect that there was a SIM card in the phone, that it was a real phone and not an emulator. So the difficulty is making sure that everybody in the company understands that, yes, they have checked the boxes and they may have become SOC 2 compliant, but SOC 2 compliance does not mention phone binding if you have a mobile app. It just doesn't. And so you have to get people in the habit of thinking in terms of, in a defensive way, what can happen to me? And when you are deploying, you are going to start detecting unusual things and learning from these things and making sure that as you get an account takeover problem or an identity theft issue or a rogue employee. I had some of my employees in a previous startup stealing money from other people's cards because they were part of the customer support team and they had figured out they had the privileges, right? And we had to put in place some additional layers to verify those things. So it's really about convincing people with examples that once they've checked the box and the auditors have said, you're good for SOC 2 for this year, you still have to think about what could go wrong with concrete examples. And concrete examples always speak very loud.
Like, why does it matter so much? I mean, I think a lot of folks in this room are venture backed, right? And like, if you have a violation, like if you got the checkbox, you're good. But then there's a violation, right? You had a breach, you had a security incident, you had a compliance incident, you had an enforcement action. And how does that impact you going forward? And that's like, if you're trying to raise money, that can take up a lot of oxygen in a conversation you're having with the venture capitalist of like, instead of explaining the awesomeness of your platform, how you're going to change the world, you're explaining, I had a compliance breach. So like, that is one way to think about kind of the not just looking at it for the check mark point in time, but looking at it as a life cycle journey.
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of look at it like what compliance is with respect to, let's say, if you're talking about the infrastructure part of it, right? So compliance is sort of telling you the kind of security controls that should be in place for you. And security controls by definition are continuous, basically, right? You don't like run a virus scanner when you're getting audited and then just stop the virus scanner after the auditor is gone, right? It just doesn't allow you to do that. So what ends up happening is that people probably leave the security controls there. I mean, when they're not serious about it, I'm saying. So they leave the security controls. Some of them sort of fall off. And the more common case, they're just blaring with alerts and nobody is actually going and looking at it. So just ignoring it and sort of like treating it as a sort of a check mark and ignoring it is not good, because guess what? You are actually recording everything. So you have sort of like written it on paper and give it on paper that I am SOC 2 compliant and gone through that audit and whatnot. And at the same time, you're ignoring all these alerts, which are actually hard facts, which are being stored in your systems and whatnot. If after the fact, someone comes and sort of audits you and so forth, they can fundamentally penalize you. This is actually worse than not going through compliance. Right? Going through a compliance, getting a certification, and then falling off of that purely because you're just ignoring and you treated it as like a rubber stamp thing is actually worse. People can sort of like sue you for misrepresentation, so to speak, right? Misrepresentation, willful neglect. And there is like hard data. You had an alert, nobody looked at it, right? I mean, like, why did you not look at it? It's worse than not having that alert, right? So that's something that you should sort of like, once you get in, you have to sort of like live with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Continuously monitoring your system and running either a platform that continuously monitors just makes your audit that much easier the next year too, because you don't have to worry about giving them as much evidence. It's already there for them. So I think now we're going to open it up to the audience if anyone has a question.
Yeah, big question, and full disclosure, had an angel fund, advised a lot of startups, have seen compliance from even military tech, which is another world, just like sitting on boards for bio companies. Where is the space for heavily regulated companies or industries where you can bring advisors in who may have a compliance background, or even lawyers through your lawyer, maybe giving you a referral or some other structure, to actually hold those places where you have to have someone who isn't a kid or a technology person from a certain area. Like if you're doing fintech, you're going to have audit and compliance with FINRA for money transfer, or else somebody's going to jail for felony money laundering, which is 90% time you do. Same thing with if you're doing any type of neobank or anything like that, especially now what's happened. So what do you see as a way in which people have been creative with startups to be able to bring in very highly, in some cases, chartered accountants, people who can do forensic audits, people who can do anti-money laundering compliance on networks, especially if they're doing any type of crypto or fintech? What are the ways in which that can be done that isn't just cash or the normal equity for advisors? How does that structure look? And oh, by the way, Amazon's done a great job helping us figure out what actually FedRAMP and the new CCME stuff that they have to comply with. And they've actually saved some startups who got into trouble with people in some of the actual regulatory groups. And we're able to show that they were in compliance with the federal standard because Amazon hosts the federal standard, including HIPAA.
So if I have to sort of like summarize the question, would it be that, okay, you're operating in this highly regulated public sector and the standards are like extremely complex? I mean, the number of controls are an order of magnitude higher. How do I go about it, right? So
normally, which are audit and accountant, and specifically for audit and for compliance on financial, and in some cases, criminal compliance for a review for money transfer, you can't usually just get them as advisors. Like usually you have to pay for that. And there's a whole structure around that. What have you seen? And also on Amazon, are there technical tools like cloud apps that allow people to test and see if they're in compliance and do like tabletop and actually like we do pen testing to see if they actually are? Because in the law, a lot of times our CEOs have to sign off on the financials and the actual company information saying they've done that. It isn't just that we thought we did our best. You have to sign off that it's been done, and you put appropriate budget, and you hired people who were actually practitioners in the space that did that. So that's a major issue for a lot of companies.
Right.
So I would not know how to answer that question for military type compliance. For anti-money laundering, money transmitting licenses, it is not too difficult to find certified lawyers, people who went through specific certifications, and you can find them on LinkedIn, by the way, where they say, hey, I've been certified to do to handle AML or to do money transmitting license requirements. And yes, you have to pay for these people, not necessarily full time. I've referred some of my clients to some of these lawyers. There's not very many of them, but they exist, and they will charge what lawyers charge, right? So you are going to have to pay them $800 an hour or more. But if they have the proper certifications, they will be able to tell you what to do for AML and for money transmitting license compliances. For AML, anti-money laundering, there's an additional technical level of difficulty, which is how do you monitor that your transactions are not, the wrong ones. There are a number of companies that do this for a living. I don't have a name that comes at the top of my mind, but you can buy specific services where people are going to look at every single one of your ACH transactions and credit card transactions and debit transactions and will trigger red flags when they think there's a red flag to be triggered. So at least in fintech, you can find the right type of lawyers. They're not cheap, but they can be found by just Googling around or searching in the LinkedIn box for people who have the particular type of AML certification that you're looking for.
So let's look at the legislation side. Now the legislation start making nonsense regulations. For example, TikTok is being banned by Montana right now. There's no way to enforce it at all. And GDPR, I understand it's human right for Europe to do it. But at the same time, a big tech company, we know who they are, is not spend more penalty in Europe, right, than paying taxes for privacy thing. It has a fixed budget, continuously run the thing forever. Because if they're doing that, they cannot make money. So compliance is optional as long as you pay.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the question, but I wanted to say that some of the security compliance is actually scalable. I think the good news, some of it is not, right? So especially the legal side of compliance, lawyers are very smart at making sure that you keep paying them forever until they get displaced by ChatGPT. But for technical stuff, it's actually fairly easy to scale. For privacy is a good example. I think the mess that we're in the US is that every single state has different privacy rules. California with CCPA and GDPR are probably the reference that everybody will use. So I think currently, at least, if you decide to be CCPA compliant, my advice to my customers is to say, hey, even if your customer is in Texas, use the CCPA compliance of California because you're probably going to be safe. I may be slightly wrong in saying this, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to cover most of the cases. Texas, New York State is very picky on privacy. But I think once you've done all the effort of being CCPA and or GDPR compliant, you're pretty safe. Some of the other things may be more fragmented, but at least that part is actually pretty scalable, I think.
I think like one key takeaway here is that if you don't know how to answer a question and Patrice is next to you, just pass on the mic to him. He can answer a question without knowing what the question is. He's a guru in compliance.
Hello, can you guys hear me? That's good. I got a two-part question, just one for the audience and then one for you. Of course, I'm a compliance enthusiast. I support security compliance and everything for startups. But I just want to ask, raise a hand, how many of them are here startups? Startups, because that's the thing. Okay, there are 10 also hands. So for the question to you is, I know we'll have this meeting, they go out. What are the 3 things they should do immediately if they have not thinking about a security and a compliance?
Why don't we do one each? So we'll get 3. Start thinking about it is my answer. That's the simplest solution here.
I think it really depends on which industry sector you're in, right? And what is your system configuration. But I think Chuck is right. You need to figure out what can go wrong with your company so that you at least identify the top priorities of making sure that at least you have some minimum level of security. A good example of that, which is not too costly, is you can buy what is called a black box penetration test or a network penetration test, which is, you've set up a website somewhere, most startups will do that, and you ask someone, you essentially tell that someone what are your IP addresses, what are your ports, and you basically ask that someone, or a tool, you can buy a tool, to try to get into your system just based on the knowledge of that thing. And that will already tell you the quality of the basic work of your engineers. That's just a very first level. I would start with this. And if you've asked your engineers to do a mobile app, I would certainly try to find somebody who does an audit of your source code to make sure that your engineers didn't do something really stupid.
See, my strategy worked again.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you should do is that if either you yourself in the organization or a management or someone has been treating compliance like a rubber stamp, you should go back and sort of like revisit that, understand your liabilities and stuff. I mean, if you have systems where alerts are blaring because no one looked at it since the last time you got your SOC 2 and stuff like that, I would say put in some reasonable effort and sort of take care of it. If you really don't want to take care of it, you rather shut it down, basically, right? But just sort of go back and make sure that be prepared for what might potentially be your liabilities and whatnot if you've gone through a compliance and you're not really taking it seriously.
Hi. So I have a question that's a little bit more specific to, I don't know if this industry was brought up yet, but I used to work at Facebook, now Meta, and left recently earlier this year. And I'm actually interested in starting up a company in the social networking space. However, after having worked at Meta, I realized there was a lot of privacy issues. I mean, not sure if that is the same as security and compliance, but definitely GDPR was brought up, et cetera. My question is so potentially in a startup situation, if I wanted to make sure that the identities of each user was a real human being, aka like identity verification, do you guys have insights on like the industry standards for how that's done these days? Because I just don't really want like an email and a phone number. I know like for banking and Coinbase specifically, they use your driver's license to verify that you can accept deposits to your wallet, etc. Do you know if that is a commonly accepted way to do identity verification nowadays? And is it able to be secure? Because obviously people be worried about identity theft.
Yeah, I would say KYC, which is the banking standard that you're typically applying. Know your customer, know your business. It's an area where like a bank would love this. There's a lot of software that's already been built out. There's companies like Alloy or Persona, Unit 21 that do this on the banking side at an incredible scale. I haven't heard about it being used for social networking. I don't know how cost effective it would be, but it certainly is like in terms of like they have a whole cascade in terms of doing know your customer. Sometimes they will ask for your ID. Sometimes they won't need to. They just go down a list depending on kind of how much they know about the customer at every stage gate.
You'll have to be careful about not creating too much friction for your customers. So you have to find the right balance between security and friction. You can certainly ask for a copy of a driver's license. Some people may go, well, I'm just trying to get into a social network. Why would I give that information? Very often in the banking space, to make sure that this is not an identity theft, right? That people haven't really just stolen a wallet with everything in it. They will do what is called a liveness test. So you are going to be asked, you're probably going to do a mobile app. So you have the benefit of having a camera on the phone. You can ask people to take a selfie, right, and smile or repeat some words so that you know that it's a real human being and not a picture of something. If you have access to the phone, you can also do a lot of things, making sure that it is a real phone, geolocating the phone. You can do all these things. I don't think there's a particular standard. Even in the banking industry, every bank will have to do that, know your customer. And the regulators are very careful not to have imposed a particular way of doing this. It's the responsibility of everybody to figure out how strong they want the identity verification to be. There are services you can buy where if people are trying to use burner phones, those phones that are prepaid, you can actually buy services from companies that will tell you from the phone number whether that phone is a postpaid phone or a prepaid phone, and how long has that phone been in service. And it's a very good red flag. If someone signs up with your service and you realize that their phone is a prepaid phone and they just bought it the previous day, that probably should be a red flag. Why are they using a brand new phone to do this? So there's a lot of companies that will sell you services. There's Twilio and Alloy and Ideology. I mean, I can give you a very long list. You'll have to figure out what is the best compromise between the level of security you want to achieve and the friction. And one way of doing this is actually to do this in stages. You may want to accept people with fairly minimum verifications, but then you limit what they can do in your network. And then when they start interacting more with you, or you start gaining trust because you've been monitoring what they do, or lack of trust, then you can do more and look at the frequency of usage. If someone signs up for your service, goes silent for a month, and then all of a sudden starts a lot of activity after a month, that's also a red flag. Why are people doing this, right? So I would advise you to probably do a staggered set of controls so that you don't overwhelm your customers up front. Otherwise, nobody's going to sign up with your service.
Yeah, no, that's very good insight. The reason I asked was because recently LinkedIn included ID verification, just recently rolled out I don't know if it's a beta, I have access to it, where you can prove you're a real person, that you can be hired by, a recruiter. But the reason I brought up this for social networks is my social network's a little different than just an online community. It's more for like localized meetups and hangouts. So kind of like, not a dating app, it's for friendship, but it's, in the news, there's been a lot of bad things that happen on dating apps where they meet someone who's not who they said they would be, and then they got kidnapped, or just bad things. So that's why I kind of brought up wanting to make sure the person has some kind of identity threat, so they feel the responsibility of not committing a crime when they meet up with a stranger or someone.
That I haven't seen in kind of the KYC ecosystem, right? Like, this is verifying this is a person. It's probably verifying their non-AML list. It's not verifying if they're a felon or they have a criminal history or something like that. So just know that, like, even when as banking has approached this, it's not as, I don't know if it would meet the bar of a local meetup.
Oh. Yeah.
Do you have apps on the App Store for Amazon where people do a lot of compliance services, like even some of the chartered accounting? So remember when we first had crypto, specifically hybrid clouds and government exposure, they had consulting companies and chartered accounting firms that would do for you the actual review as a service on the cloud. Are they offering some of those?
We have our AWS marketplace, so we can talk after this. Yeah, we'll talk.
No, of course. All right. Yeah, we only have one more question. Time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to ask, is there a different experience for startups than for compliance regimes that were instituted in established companies where, they had to uproot a lot of processes, they had to change a lot of the ways that they thought about internal ways of doing business, compared to startups who come after the compliance goes into law? You're already starting from the position that you can build these processes directly in. Is there a different experience as far as companies that grow up in the experience of a compliance regime versus have to adopt it after the fact?
Yes, so that's why we're trying to get startups to adopt it earlier in the process. So just about every SOC 2 is going to have to go through a SOC 2 assessment. It's usually required by the VCs or your customer base. So, normally you start with that, or CIS, the Center for Internet Security Controls, you can utilize those to, get a handle on what your security posture is and then build up from there. SOC 2, and then you have to figure out what is my customer base asking for? Do I need to worry about PCI or HIPAA or FedRAMP, like you said? So as you scale up, then yes, you have to keep iterating on your processes because your workload is constantly changing, right? You're bringing in new features, you're bringing in new services. So it's constant work. You're going to have to change your processes as you build, and then we mentioned FedRAMP. So you get to FedRAMP, and usually you have to build a whole nother workload for FedRAMP because when you're working with the federal government, you cannot iterate as quickly because they are requiring you to go through them for significant changes on your workload and things like that. So as you scale up, different things come into play and different processes, but you mature those processes because you have those policies and procedures in place, and you just make sure you have everyone in place to handle that, or you utilize partners to help you scale and build and grow, because they can start, like Duplo Cloud. If you PCI, you start with SOC 2, and then you're moving to PCI, then you're moving to HIPAA, whatever. They can help you scale with that and with your policies, procedures, processes, whatever you need. But just if you do get to FedRAMP, usually you have to build a whole separate workload for that because you just cannot change those services and features without getting approval or significant change requests through your federal agency. So. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here, and I want to thank everyone for coming and listening to us. And thank you again to the Compliance Alliance for hosting this event. And I guess now we're going to talk and drink and have fun.